Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Here we are again. As you will have read elsewhere, since moving to the country and becoming a gentleman farmer, I've been performing some unaccustomed labor, and I injured my wrist the other day, and it's hard for me to type. So I'm going to give you the lectures this week in little mini videos like this, which you can watch, at your leisure and as many times as you want. Which will save my hand from typing so much. So I want to talk about in this one about the Exodus, the second book in the Pentateuch, and suggest some ways to approach it. But let me begin with some ancient history. This nation of Israel, and you will see how they got that name. In ancient times, they were simply one of a number of nomadic tribes that were wandering around in the desert, in Palestine and other places in the Middle East. And, they wandered around, they found places to water their flocks. They were sort of what we would call hunter-gatherers in that development. And there were a bunch of these tribes out there, individual, independent peoples. And I suspect peripherally and totally as an aside, part of the problems in the Middle East to this day are the fact that the people there have maintained this sort of tribal identity. But be that as it may, these people who became the nation of Israel, or the Israelites, were one of probably dozens of independent tribes wandering around out there. And then gradually, through a sequence of superior intellect perhaps, or good organization, or better grazing lands, or who knows why, gradually this particular group of people gained preeminence and began to organize themselves as a visible and recognizable nation. And so what we have in the Pentateuch, that early record, is their attempt to talk about their history and explain how they came to be as a nation. And they did. They went from being a completely anonymous tribe to the nation of Israel in, a period of 1,000 years or so, probably, although we don't know. And part of that identity was forged in the events that are recounted in the second book of the Pentateuch, called Exodus. It's the process of them coming out of being subservient to another nation and going through a period of self-determination and self-definition. And, sorry, my phone started to ring. Self-definition and, what was I saying? Self-determination. All right. In a sense, it's not unlike the American Revolution, where this nation was subject to another nation and broke itself off from that nation and went through a period of self-definition. And completely similarly, we created a series of documents that helped that process along. Just exactly as they did. And we revere our documents in the way that they revered those documents. So there's nothing unexpected or unusual here. It's just that their written down history is a little more complicated than our official documents. So, all right, I've said that. What you'll notice and what I'll tell you about the book of Exodus is it's very frustrating to read for a number of reasons. Even for scholars, it's frustrating. And the main reason is the redaction in Exodus is a mess. You remember the word redactor. For our purposes, we can call it an editor. It's a lot more than that, as Gable suggests. But for our purposes, we can say the final entity, person who took all this material and put it together later on in Israelite history is the redactor. And the redaction in Exodus is a total mess. If you compare it with the first book, Genesis is fairly linear. Things kind of move from one event to the next sequentially. Exodus, on the other hand, has a circular structure to it. You'll see as they're getting close to Mount Sinai, then they're there, and then the very next piece of the account has them back out in the desert wandering around again. And so it's hard to read for a reader because it's fragmented in a way that Genesis really isn't. So there are two reasons possible for that. One is the final redactor simply had all these legends that had already achieved some kind of prominence and importance and significance, and so he, rather than trying to blend them and make a consistent narrative, he just stuck them together because he didn't know what else to do with them. Because each tradition was reverenced by a certain group of people, and he wanted to maintain that integrity of each individual story rather than trying to smooth them over. So he just put them together and let the chips fall. There's that possibility. The other possibility is that the circular nature of the narrative itself is mirroring the process of the Israelites coming and circling and narrowing in on their cultic center, i.e. Mount Sinai. And so that it was deliberately put together in this way to mirror the process. That from a literary standpoint is called mimesis, mimesis, and it means a study of the way that artistic elements reflect the actual experience. So if you have a circular, you sort of get close and then you back away and then you get close again, you back away again, and you write your narrative in that way, your narrative will respect the fragmented nature of the experience, and it'll also both reflect and respect. So you're going to find Exodus a little bit frustrating, and you can decide why it's as messy as it is. Either the guy didn't know what he was doing, or didn't know how to handle the individual sources, or he made it that way in order to reflect a larger purpose. Honestly, I don't know which one I think. I think if I were doing it, I would have done it differently. That's all I can say. So let me talk about a couple quick things. This movement towards Mount Sinai, which becomes the cultic center of the culture, it's reflected in a number of things. Noticeably, the construction of the altar, which was the central place where worship could take place. Early on, the models for an altar is you could worship anywhere. You just piled up a pile of dirt and you sacrificed your ritual animals on it, and that was valid. The deity would hear your prayers. And then a little bit later on, the official model for the altar is you can still worship anywhere, but it's got to be, instead of just piled up rocks or piled up dirt, the rocks have to be hewn, so they have to be shaped and made into a table. Still, you can do it anywhere, but you can't just pile up rocks. You have to work on them and make them nice and neat and make them fit together. You see where I'm going with this. As the pieces of the narrative fit together, have shaped to fit together, the pieces of the altar are beginning to be shaped. And in fact, they have found in the Holy Land some examples of these stones, altar areas that have been crafted in this way. There are several of them out there, and archaeologists are quite excited about that. And then the third model of the altar and the center for worship is it can only be in the temple on Mount Sinai in Jerusalem, and it has to be very ornate, and there's all kinds of rules and construction plans and everything else that you're going to read on how this thing was to be made and what it was to look like and how big it was to be. So the movement from piling up a pile of stones anywhere and worshiping to piling up a pile of stones anywhere but making the stones, working on them, crafting them, shaping them so that they become acceptable, but still you can do it anywhere, to this highly ornate organization and construction in Jerusalem being the only place where worship is valid in a sense. That development of that particular artifact, the altar, is reflected in and reflected by the development of the cultural myth as it shapes itself. You take the pieces, you put them together first, then you take them and you shape them and make a story out of them, and then you make the story out of them. The other reflection of this development of the nation from a completely nomadic, anonymous culture to the settled, recognizable, rich nation of Israel is reflected in the names that they call their deity. We've talked a little bit about that, and it's an interesting thing. You'll notice at the end of the second creation account, the Garden of Eden story, you'll notice at the end of that it says this was the first time that God was called by name. And what that means is this was the first time that they recognized the Jesos, the Yahwist, or the Jehovist as their particular God, and they claimed that by naming it. And this was the first time, as the text says, that this was done. The Israelite God has a number of other names. But what's interesting is the model of the God changes as you see the development of the really the legal and cultural society develops. The God, their vision of God changes. Remember, we're not talking about an objective God. We're talking about their subjective impression, what they felt about their God. And that's quite interesting. And not only does the name change, but the characteristics change. The earlier Hebrew God is very different from the later one in interesting ways. And I think that's also reflected in this movement from disorganized, sort of barbaric culture and existence to this highly settled, civilized culture. So I'm sorry that Exodus is such a mess, and I'm sorry that most of us, including me, find it pretty frustrating. But if you separate those things out, read it a little at a time, and don't take an objective view, take a subjective view. You're reading this piece right here, and when you're reading this piece right here, you are reading that writer's impression of the development of his culture. Same thing with the other one. The next piece, reading the subjective impressions of the writer in his culture. Okay? So that's the end of this little first video. I'll introduce you, and I'll try to guide you through some of Exodus, and I'll have some things to say in the next one about your papers and how you might start looking for data and elements to include in your papers. All right, I'm going to stop and get this one up for you, and then I'll do the next one. Thanks.